Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is still January 14th, 2025. It's about 12:30 in the afternoon, and we are going to continue our work with the administration on the Budget Adjustment Act. We're going to be going over the language today. When they are done, just to sort of give you a sense of what's happening, we will take a break. That's at about 2 o'clock. There is a chairs and vice chairs training. So Jim and I will be departing, and Tip will take over running the meeting. We have JFO coming to talk to us. Emily will be here, and Maria, some more overview of some budget adjustment things and other things. And they will stick around for a little while. So if you have questions about anything that's you've heard, anything that's in your portfolio, Lynn, I just have to give you your portfolio, but everybody else has theirs, and then we'll put that up on the website. So you can ask any questions. And then, so it'll probably be a slightly earlier afternoon. Again, check the committee page on a regular basis. It really does change often. Tomorrow, we're going to start at 9:30. We have judiciary in at 9:30. And we'll have some more orientation, and then we'll have state's attorneys and sheriffs and public safety. And then human services starts. So we're going to have a whole chunk of human services over the next, through tomorrow and Thursday. And then on Friday, Erin is still working on things, but we will have, Friday still shows TBD if you look at our webpage, but she's lining up several people that will need to come testify for the budget adjustment. Is there anything else I'm supposed to say? Anybody? I think we're good. And there's an updated version, Aaron's asked, and you had that on your desk now, the budget adjustment language, if you asked for it and responded to.
So is the previous one like automatic recycling?
You can recycle it unless you took special notes that you want to transfer to the.
No.
Okay. So Adam and Hardy, do you want to come join us at the table and we'll get started? Oh, I do want to speak on that thing, have a seat, but we are going to have a public hearing on the Budget Adjustment Act. We, thanks to Jim, who remembers that we do this every year. It's going to happen during the day, during our work time. It's not an evening event, and we have scheduled it, just scheduled it for next Thursday, January 23rd. It'll be from 1 to 2:30. We'll have it here in this room. People will be able to Zoom in if they want to talk, or they can come here and present. So it'll be 90 minutes. People will probably have 2 minutes. I think that's what we've done, to tell us whatever it is they want to tell us. Anybody can provide written testimony. That will be in the press release too. So if people can't come but want to say something, they'll have that opportunity to do that as well. So they don't actually need to come to the meeting to get, and we will all look at all the testimony and be here for that. So any questions about public hearing? Yes.
Are we sending anything up to the policy committee?
We will be. Yes. Yeah. So that will be coming too. Now, thank you for interrupting one more time, and let's take it away.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management. And Hardy Merrill, Deputy Commissioner of Finance. So you folks, on Friday, we reviewed the spreadsheet that we provided for you that reviewed each of the appropriations and transfers, the changes in use that are reflected in the budget adjustment. And we promised to come back today to talk about language. Kind of as a preamble, I would say two things. First, the first part of the language document essentially repeats verbally everything that we covered. And Hardy and I are prepared to go through that with you again. However, I thought what we would do in the interest of time, if nothing else, is to review the parts of the budget adjustment we did not touch on, so that we can review a lot of these are non-numerical. There are changes in language, changes statute that are proposed. So most, I would say, in fact, up to, I was going to start on page 34, really up to page 34 is a repeat of what we've dealt with in the spreadsheet, changes in appropriations in the B section and the D section of the big bill. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think you folks are aware that there are what are called letters of intent that are issued after the budget passes. There were two letters of legislative intent issued after this budget. One was, I think, on June 28th, and the other was July 24th. July 24th. So when we submit a budget, we bring it to you as we will in 2 weeks. And you might say, we have the luxury of, if we have certain changes we'd like to make, we're human beings, occasionally we make mistakes, we will come to you and say, by the way, this is what the budget says, and here's what we intended to do. And you guys can make changes, or if it's not caught early enough, we can go to the Senate. So we have a chance. When you guys pass a budget, you don't have that luxury, in that the budget passes here, goes to the Senate, conference committee gets together, and when that budget is passed, it goes to the governor. He's got 5 days to sign it or not. There's not really a time period when he can stroll down here and say, by the way. So that's what the letters of intent are intended to do. They're intended to say, look, this, what's in there, here's what the intention is, if it's not clear to us. So.
Pause for 1 second.
Yes.
Aaron, letters of intent, can we put those documents up on our webpage? Because I'm not sure everybody has seen those, so.
And the reason I bring that up is because in this language, you'll see many references to the letters of intent. And, those are letters that are written by the legislative folks. They're signed by the chair of House Appropriations and the chair of Senate Appropriations. And they're sent to us saying, here's what we intended in case, and sometimes we will have raised questions. Well, should we be sending money to here or there? And so anyway, you'll see in this document mention probably a dozen times or so to the letter of intent. So that's what that refers to. So, Madam Chair, without further ado, I would advise, with your permission, skipping to page 34, section 50. And that is really kind of the first part of the budget adjustment that we haven't dealt with, but I think we should explain why it's in there. So section 50 deals with the property transfer tax. And you'll recall that typically in section D100, there's an allocation of the property transfer tax that happens. This year was a little bit bizarre. By that, I mean, and this, by the way, is featured in the letter of intent. By that, I mean the big bill, the budget, which is now Act 113, passed and was signed by the governor the last week of May, I think May 23rd. In that bill, they allocated in section D100 the property transfer tax, which is typical. Subsequent to that, Act 181 passed. That was a kind of an omnibus bill that dealt with, I think, biodiversity, permitting, land use, a bunch of stuff. And among other things, it made some changes to appropriations and fees and the like at DFR, I forget where else. Anyway, in that bill, they changed the property transfer tax allocation. The percentages. So for example, now a third of the transfer tax is sent directly to the general fund. A half is sent to the Vermont Conservation Board trust fund used by VHCB and the like. Those percentages were changed, not by a lot, but enough to make a difference in the allocations. That in itself is not unusual, but the unusual part is Act 181 passed several weeks after the budget and it was effective immediately. The budget passed several weeks beforehand and was effective July 1st. So essentially Act 181 canceled out everything in the budget and we were left kind of scratching our heads thinking, all right, so anyway, it wasn't difficult to see what the legislature intended to do. So what you'll see here is reflected in the intent, which was in Act 181, which was the intention to do. So the allocation and percentages have been changed, and that changes the numbers. So the numbers you see here are a reflection of Act 181 that passed. And all the changes you see are kind of putting the two bills together and coming out with what the legislative intent was.
Do you remember what the new percentages were?
Off the top of my head, I'll say general fund went from, well, I think the first change was 2% used to go to PB&R at tax. That's now 1.5%. 33% used to go to the general fund. I think that's now 37%. 17% used to go to the municipal and regional planning commissions. I believe that is 13%. These are all very top of the head. I'll send it to you after.
That would be.
I'll send it to you to see whether I'm right or wrong, but
Okay.
they weren't dramatic changes, but they were, I mean, enough when you're dealing with large sums of money, small changes in percentage can make a
Did the
difference.
VHCV one go up then?
That stayed the same.
That stayed at 50.
That was 50%.
Okay.
It's still 50%.
Okay, thank you.
So anyway, in section 50, this language, and this, by the way, was a joint venture with the good folks at the Joint Fiscal Office, the Financial Operations Division of Finance and Management, and our budget director. So I think we've achieved consensus here. Anyways, let's just here reflect that. On page 40, which is skipping ahead to section 53. By the way, and I'm skipping over the recommended reversions. My colleague Artie has done a fair amount of work on that, and I think, you know, he is willing, if like, to come back and speak about that in detail or not.
And
But here are the reversions that you see.
right, and so I just want to point out to the committee, some of your budget areas may have reversions, so you'll want to be checking those out. There's various things. I'm looking at military affairs or childcare or use tax reimbursement, I'm not worried about the $5.10 one, but we have some in the multi-millions, and that's probably a good idea to just check out what those are.
And we will actually speak about the $5.10 ones later on in our presentation. You'll see some language that will actually get rid of the $5.10 reversions.
Last year we had a 97-cent one, so
Right.
we're improving.
So on page 40, you'll remember actually that the section 53 starts on the bottom of page 39, but you'll remember yesterday I mentioned that we had, you know, about, I think, $197 million money to allocate based on the emergency board revenue upgrade, based on some transfers and reversions and the like. And of that 197, we were going to put to work or to appropriate or transfer about $110 million, which leaves about $85 million of additional revenue we were not going to use immediately. And we were going to set up a temporary reserve to kind of put a fence around that money and carry it forward into fiscal 26, and then provide you, when we present the budget, with the governor's proposal of using that money. The construct that we created to do that is on the middle of page 40, the notwithstanding language. And you know what the language says is typically there is statutory guidelines for what happens with unreserved and unallocated. In other words, surplus money at the end of the year. Not infrequently, that language is not withstood when, for example, last year you folks set up a contingency appropriations and the like. We are saying here that notwithstanding that language, in other words, we are not using that waterfall language or statutory language. We're notwithstanding that, and we're putting additional money we anticipate to be sitting on the bottom line, yet we're not ready today to appropriate, we are putting it in a temporary reserve. So that's why you see the notwithstanding language there.
So just to remind folks here, because a lot of this is new,
Right.
our revenues came in much higher than we expected. And that's why we have this money. If our revenues had come in $70 million below, we would have having a completely different conversation and figuring out where to cut to make the budget balance for the end of the year. We will make the budget balance. But we've been lucky enough to have revenue that exceeded our projections.
So this section sets up that temporary reserve that will carry forward money that is, unallocated at the end of the year into fiscal 26. When Hardy and I return here in 2 weeks and present a budget, we will have proposed uses for that money.
Okay, great.
Questions on that? And then section 57 on page 52. Pardon me, 42. So, and this, I suspect your Committee on Ways and Means will have more to say on this review. We are in Act 145, which I believe Representative Maslin and others sponsored and passed. It was kind of a modernization of the tax code. And they charged the Department of Taxes with reviewing the so-called telephone tax with the idea of repealing it and replacing it with another form of taxation, basically folding it into the property tax. This language does that. However, this language continues that. However, what tax is saying, and this came from them, is that this is a longer project than they anticipated. They are hiring a contractor to advise them on this. They have not yet, but they are imminently going to sign a contract to help advise on this and get it done. But it's a fairly beefy project for a fairly small tax, but they're asking for more time. So that's what this section does. It basically pushes out 1 year completion. But again, they will be happy to come in and speak to you about that. But it's, I think it's a good idea. It's just taking them longer to kind of get it done than they anticipated.
Is
With
that all
that,
you had in the 50s? Okay.
I'm passing the baton.
Okay, I think we'll jump ahead to section 65. And section 65 begins on page 46. And so section 65 amends not the big bill, but 2024 Acts and Resolves number 183, which is also typically referred to as the yield bill. It was H887. This is one of the adjustments that's a response to the statement of legislative intent, the intent letter that Adam spoke about, dated June 28th, 2024. The last item listed on the intent letter pertains to this act, and section 24A, compensation for overpayment. I'll just quickly read what was in the intent letter provided to us by the legislature. So it reads, section 24A of H887 makes numerous transfers to towns in the Canaan School District and the Northeast Kingdom Choice School District that overpaid education property taxes in fiscal year 2024 due to erroneous accounting of certain students for the purposes of calculating average daily membership. It is the intent of the General Assembly that the Canaan School District and Northeast Kingdom Choice School District be reimbursed the overpayment through the most efficient administrative means necessary, and that the administration provide any necessary retroactive corrective language as part of the fiscal year 2025 budget adjustment. So the districts were in fact reimbursed through the most efficient administrative means necessary, which is contrary to what was written in the original bill. And this is the necessary retroactive corrective language that follows. So essentially, what happened here? Well, first I'll speak to what's a technical correction in subsection A, which was essentially sending a credit to the Canaan School District. It was the technical language we found needed some correction, which it refers to a transfer from the ed fund to the town. And the word transfer in our in our legal language refers to the movement from a fund, in this case, the education fund, but to another fund, not to a town, not to some other entity. That's an expenditure. So we're just making that that technical correction there to refer to the terminology, to eliminate the problematic transfer terminology. And then we're also referring to, rather than the town of Canaan, we're making the credit to the Canaan Town School District, which is a different entity. And the reason for that is, and the same will apply for all the strikeouts of individual towns and amounts, and replace them with the language referring to the Northeast Kingdom Choice School District. The reason for that is essentially, and we touch on it in the explanation, but the town, if we just sent sums to towns, the town officials would have no way of knowing how to allocate the ed fund payment among the state's homestead property taxpayers only, unless such allocation was specifically provided by the state. And if the town recorded the payments as town revenue, there would be no way to ensure the benefits accrued only to the state's homestead taxpayers. So what we're doing is, instead of providing credits to the individual towns, we're providing now 2 credits, one of them sent to the Canaan Town School District and the other to the Northeast Kingdom Choice School District. And if you look at subsection B as rewritten, that $68,132 sum, that figure represents the sum of all the underlying amounts that were itemized to each of the individual towns. And in fact, I did just check it on my calculator to ensure I figured you would, to ensure that was the case and there were no typos. So this is an example of one of those technical adjustments where we've already gone ahead and, with the legislature's intent guidance, executed this. But this is a cleanup after the fact to ensure that law as written comports with what actually took place. So any questions on?
Yes.
So I understand the credit piece here, so it doesn't look like it's expenditure part of things here, but how does that trickle down for town with like taxpayers, since they already paid their bill? Right.
So what it means is they will pay less in the next year, because that payment, by going to the district, it carries forward and now it's applied to the district's expenditures in the next year. So it's after the fact.
A couple of towns were confused about how that's going to go. So, thank you.
Is that helpful enough?
It is.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on, I think we'll go to section 66 on page 48. So the next section, this is amending 2023 Acts and Resolves number 78 B1100. So this is amending not the fiscal year 25 big bill, but the fiscal year 24 big bill from the prior fiscal year. And what we're doing here is not adjusting an amount. So typically we only adjust the amounts of current year appropriations in the Budget Adjustment Act, but there may be other language changes. And one thing you might see, which is the case here, is we're changing and in fact expanding the allowable use of a prior year, fiscal year 2024 appropriation, for which the funds have carried forward. So in fact, at the end of fiscal 24, this $15 million appropriation of general fund to be used to offset the cost of denied claims for FEMA reimbursement. That appropriation at the end of fiscal year 24 still had over $13 million left in it. So it is still, there's still plenty remaining for continued expenditure. And part of that is probably related to the fact that, as we know, FEMA reimbursement claims are a somewhat protracted process. But what this language is proposing to do is to expand the use to be used not only to offset the cost of denied FEMA claims for FEMA reimbursement, but also for distribution to departments to fund the unanticipated admin costs related to recovery efforts from declared disasters, as well as statewide costs related to administering the American Rescue Plan Act, Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Fund programs, including the costs of related limited service positions and contracting for programs and services. So essentially, where this language came from is from our recovery office. So they're involved in all things disaster, not just FEMA claims, but other expenses, related to disaster recovery. That office has also continued to sort of manage the responsibility for the ARPA, state fiscal relief funds and the wind down and final disposition of those funds as well. So the recovery office really, brought us this language to say we've got, quite a bit of spending authority still remaining in the FEMA denial reserve. We've got other, pressing needs that we would like to draw on this sum for. And I'd encourage, you to invite the recovery office, as I'm sure you probably already were, to explain more about this.
So this is a big change from what we had, to what we allocated the money. And so I want to be sure that the people who cost of denied claims, is that the cost to individuals of denied claims?
No, this is, I don't believe so. I believe this appropriation, which is to the Agency of Administration.
Okay.
And so this is, as we often, typically when these large appropriations are made to the Agency of Administration for distribution to departments, it's not for, this is not applying to individuals. So we had about, so the FEMA public assistance flows directly to the state for damage to state infrastructure. So for example, the office building that we work in that was closed for a year and had significant expenditure for repairs. This would also apply to, transportation infrastructure that's owned and by the state.
Okay.
Things like this.
Property.
So these are in-state costs.
Okay.
But what it's saying is, so essentially, I'll give you what I think would probably be a good example. There may have been expenses incurred by departments related to either the original 2023 flood disaster or subsequent disasters, as we've had some since then. There may have been expenses incurred by departments that may not even be like direct, like FEMA reimburses for the direct damage. They may not reimburse for certain other things and expenses that are going on that departments are just spending money on. For instance, when we were talking with the Agency of Digital Services, which is not someone you think of as, boots on the ground disaster recovery. And we were asking about, what are some of these expenses and why weren't they recovered by timesheet billing? And it's, well, no, we just had to jump and stand up these dashboards, stand up these various services. Those are not necessarily, that's not like direct damage to infrastructure that's part of a FEMA claim, but they may now have a budget shortfall and want to be reassured. As an example, so
it was related to, even if it wasn't direct flooding.
That's right. And so as the language reads, it's or for distribution to departments to fund the unanticipated administrative costs related to recovery efforts from declared disasters. So that's an example, perhaps off the top of my head, just because we were recently meeting, with ADS to review budget stuff that I think of. The recovery office could speak, in much greater detail to, I think, the intent behind this, but that's what we're talking about here. It's not pertaining to, individual citizens' claims with FEMA. That was never what this appropriation was for. This was for state costs for which the reimbursement may be denied.
And Rep. Bush.
Yeah, I think you just said it, but I was going to say that this is essentially you're trying to get a hold of all those unanticipated administrative costs that came out that had to be dealt with during the crisis, and trying to fill in the holes that were left by it.
And in budget adjustment, because there may, again, this is, there have been, we had additional flooding just this past summer. And there was a need for additional, responses and departments to go into action, do whatever needed to be done, but there's not a mechanism to make them whole in their budget. In this current fiscal year, if they made such expenses.
And how much do you think this is, do you think you're going to use the remaining 13 million, or do you have any idea of how much you're actually going to use of that money?
I would ask you to speak to the recovery office on
Okay.
that. Because again, I think it's a pretty long, originally when the 15 was carved out, I think it was contemplating a fairly long runway for its deployment. So where it stands now and what the update is, I couldn't speak to that myself.
I think we're getting him in for that anyway. Rep. Harrison?
Okay, so we can delay my question if appropriate, but I guess adding this flexibility language here, do you have an idea of where the bulk of that will go?
To be honest, I would be speculating without having to hear it. So
Is it BGS? Is it, Department or Secretary of State's office for their, I don't know where.
if I were to speculate, I would guess some of the field departments' most active boots on the grounds are, for instance, your DPS and your BGS, and perhaps AOT, but
We'll get that.
Douglas Farnham is
Yeah,
well aware of.
right. And we had him talk about ARPA and sort of updating us through the through the calendar year end, and we want to get him back on flood things. So this will be part of that flood
He
conversation.
can give you a
Right.
right up to the moment.
so on section 66, any other questions, or are we set there for now? Okay. So we'll jump to the next section, section 67 now. This is another example of amending a prior year appropriation to expand its allowable purpose. This is actually going back to fiscal year 2023. And in fiscal year 2023, funds were appropriated from the Technology Modernization Special Fund. In this case, 11.8 million for enterprise resource planning system upgrade. As it originally read, it was for core statewide financial accounting system and integration with the DOL and AOT financial systems. We're proposing to expand the use of that appropriation for human capital management, which is also part of the same ERP modernization program. And in fact, the human capital management upgrade as part of the ERP modernization program, what that essentially means is replacing Vermont's current VTHR, human resources management and timekeeping and payroll, compensation, benefits, absence management, everything HR is currently in using this platform called VTHR. And we are in the process now using an appropriation from FY 2022 that was appropriated to the Agency of Administration for replacement of that system. We're in the process, we were just kicking it off actually this month, of replacing VTHR. with a $12.8 million general fund appropriation to the Agency of Administration. Since that original 2022 appropriation, which was just for the HR system, was made, in the subsequent fiscal year in 2023, a appropriation was made for replacement of the state's financial system. That's what's being referred to here. However, in the context of the project as it's actually being implemented, it's all one great big project, and it's using the same software, which is called Workday. And there's been a fair amount of testimony on this to, I think, Information Technology, Joint Information Technology Committee. So because the project is actually, it's all one great big thing using one piece of software that will do everything for the state, HCM and the finance. What this request is doing is to say, well, this pot of money can also be used for the human capital management part. And one of the reasons for that is the sequencing of the project is that phase one, which is taking place between now and October 2026, really, is the human resources replacement piece. And then the financial replacement piece is not scheduled currently to start until October 2026. And a lot of the reason for that is the demands on our staff are so great, including a lot of the people that work in my office, that trying to completely blow up and replace both the human resources system and the financial system at the same time is really not feasible. So they're being sequenced.
This is a big change from last year. Yeah, go ahead, Rep. Harrison.
Yeah, I don't remember all the conversations last year, but I believe there were some issues with the ERP system in terms of that rollout, if I memory serves me. And one of the things we did, whether it was in the BAA or the budget, was to provide some funds for the internal staff workings to design whatever it is we do. But that
You provided the perfect segue, Representative Harrison, for me to explain why we now need to make this amendment and change the use of the second appropriation for financials. So in the governor's recommended BAA last year at this time, when we were sitting before you, what the request was for an additional $3 million. Okay, to get the human resources project really to the finish line. And what that was for essentially is the original appropriation didn't include certain costs. It included really only the technology cost that came from ADS. And what in fact is required is we have to do some other activities. The business transformation activity involves hiring a consultant to work with state departments in terms of identifying all the processes that we currently have that are going to need to be blown up and thrown out the window and replaced somehow with this new Workday platform. And how are we going to make our existing processes fit into the new Workday cloud platform, which is, really not customizable. We're going to have to adapt certain processes to fit in. The other thing it didn't include was staff backfill. So when we have, for instance, coming up, we have financial staff in the Department of Finance and Management that are going to start contributing. They're getting put on 4 to 8 hour a day meeting schedules and time commitments. And that's not even replacing the financial system. That's on the HR system, because the HR system has to feed into our financial system to actually cut the checks out of the bank. And that all has to work. And that requires a great deal of time. What the administration asked for last year was $3 million to support these additional costs, basically to businesses. They're not costs that are paid by ADS. The original budget was set just on what's paid by ADS. So really your implementation vendor, your software licenses, your ADS project management staff, and so forth. We said we need another $3 million. And what came back in the ultimate BAA pass was, well, we'll modify the $12.8 million we already gave you to allow for these other purposes, but you're not getting another $3 million. Well, what that means is you just, now that we're paying for and in fact have contracted and added limited service staff out of the first appropriation, that appropriation will not be sufficient to complete the phase one. So now we will need to begin drawing on the second appropriation in order to bring phase one to completion. And since phase two, which this appropriation is for, on the schedule, we're not even looking at commencing that activity until October 2026. We're saying we're going to need to use that money to finish phase one before, rather than save it for phase two. And
It's so clear now.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
This thing has been going on for years and it's been really frustrating. Is this the same one where we have to pay $2 million in May and we don't get anything for it? I mean, like, there's been this $2 million a year thing. Is that a different one? Do you remember that?
I would have to find out what the contract details are on this.
Well, fine.
No,
Jim
no,
has ADS, right?
you're
I think, so
yeah.
we have a lot of issues with this. Rep Stevens and then Rep Lynch.
I would pass, thanks.
Okay.
So you bought commercial software, is that what you're doing, or are you having people code software?
Yes, this is a cloud, as I understand it, this is a cloud-based commercial package. It's from a company called Workday.
You're not going to be able to modify it in the future. But then what you're talking about is now, once you've got that so that it's functional, you have all the data that's in your old system, and your staff are going to have to migrate that to databases that will be able in the new system. And that's going to take a lot of money and effort to do that.
There's a lot of work,
That's what you're talking about.
and I am, yeah. I think when I talk about the 3 million ask last year, I think it has less to do with the data migration and that specifically, but more to do with, okay, we've got like, a number of different departments that have different ways of doing timekeeping. Some of them are still doing it on paper. I understand. And different ways of interacting with the current system. We're going to a new system and we want everybody on the same system. That's going to involve work in each department to figure out, it's really business process work, re-engineering business process to work with the new system more than it is coding. This isn't coding, and these aren't computer people. These are
The business process part. So the people that are involved in the new software are going to come and try to help your folks figure out how to make that system all.
That's right. And actually, to put a finer point on it, a contractor that recently began working with the state, like as of last week, is someone who's not, they are not actually from the software company or from the company hired to implement the software, but they've got a lot of experience working with this particular kind of software and making businesses or governments, whatever the users are, figuring out how to work within this new framework. That's and that's the nature of this work, as well as I mentioned, some backfilling of staff resources so that the background work can continue to take place. For instance, in finance and management, well, leadership are involved in the, in this implementation work.
Yeah, is there, have you allocated, or is there any of the money that we've talked about in all of these allocations and appropriations over the time? Is there something that you have to do where you run both systems at the same time for a period of time? I mean, that costs money too. As you start this process of re-implementing the new one.
So, and that's part of why, so as the schedule reads right now, we're going to continue for about 2 years, continue to use the VTHR human resources system while we are building the new Workday human resources system. Then in about 2 years, we'll go live onto the new Workday And it will then be interacting with our existing financial system. And
when that's finished.
and
then
then for a period of 2 years, we'll be working on
Yeah.
the replacement for the existing financial system. And then it will, at the other end, in 4 years or so, it's all on the Workday platform. But you're correct that you need to continue to operate your existing system until the new one is built and we know it works and it's been tested, and then there's the go live.
So where's the money for that?
So we're already paying for the existing systems.
That's in the base budget.
In our operating budget, in our operating budget. So what's called the Vision Fund, it's an internal service fund. And that's in the operating budget. The building of the new systems are in these one-time appropriations. So eventually, as the old system comes off and the new system comes on, now the new system will be paid out of the operating budget after it's been implemented. But during implementation, it's using the one-time funding.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Rep. Consent.
Just real quick. So you'd have all the staffing in place to kind of make all that happen with, implementation of the software monitoring, which you still have without cutting that off. Transition piece, and maybe that's one thing you don't really know.
So we're bringing on staff.
Yeah, sure.
There's an awful lot we could talk about in this project.
That's just-
I don't think this is the right forum.
But this has been going on for.
We're predominantly on the money end. We just checks. But I mean, to Artie's point, I mean, it will have a major impact on our own department because we'll be replacing both our budgeting and our accounting software. But we can speak about this for a long, long time, I
This is
suspect.
Jim's budget portfolio. I did not give it to anybody. Well, Scott HR.
You've added them.
So let's continue.
So moving on,
To do, yeah.
handing back off to me, and we're going to do some of the.
Okay.
On page 49, section 69. Here you see what I would call the somewhat inelegant method of canceling or eliminating a special fund. You'll recall that in the transfer section of the spreadsheet that we reviewed for you, we transferred the balance in the Workforce Education and Training Fund into the general fund. And, that balance has been maintained for, again, as long as I've been in this job. It's been at least 7 or 8 years. And that was originally a fund that was set up, as the name implies, for education and training of the workforce through the Department of Labor. It was funded through the Next Generation Fund, which in turn was funded by a transfer from the general fund. The Next Generation Fund was eliminated 10 or 12 years ago. And the functions that were funded by this special fund were brought into the base of the Department of Labor. So it's not like we're saying workforce education and training is no longer important. What we're saying is we're doing these exact same things within the Department of Labor's base allocation, base appropriation. So for, again, 7 or 8 years, we haven't drawn on the fund. We haven't contributed to the fund either. It's just sat there. So what we're saying is let's just revert that money, put it in the general fund. And
So this should be in the reversions here somewhere.
it's actually being transferred. I used it.
Oh, okay.
For transfer.
And wasn't that around 2.4 million or?
2.5 million. Yeah.
2.5 million.
So this again is the inelegant way we get rid of a fund. We just strike a line. The next section is section 70. And this too, I mean, in a sense, it's kind of comporting with current practice. In statute currently, the Tobacco Trust Fund is the recipient of excess revenue or excess amounts of unallocated money in the Tobacco Litigation Settlement Fund. And what current statute directs is that anything that, any unencumbered balance in the litigation settlement fund will be automatically transferred to the tobacco trust fund. Practice has been, for again, as long as I've been here, in fact, quite a bit before I've been here, is that language is not withstood and the money is directed typically to the general fund. So we typically notwithstand statute, we sweep that money into the, or we transfer that money into the general fund. You'll note that in section D101B of Act 113, that is what is done. There's a $3 million transfer from the litigation settlement fund into the tobacco trust fund. And that is current practice. At the beginning of that section, there's a notwithstand language that notwithstands statute, not just for the tobacco litigation settlement fund, but a number of different funds. So all that we're doing here is saying, look, current practice is we've not withstood this for years. However, if the intent of the General Assembly is to transfer tobacco litigation settlement fund money into the trust fund, do it. Just do it in session. You can do it anytime you want, but you haven't, and it's been many years. So why not, instead of notwithstanding every year, why not just get rid of that language in statute and allow the legislature at its, at its will to do that anytime it wants.
Just refresh us, where is the litigation settlement fund and what expenditures currently go out of that fund?
So that is a fund that is actually in section D101. You see a $3 million transfer out of that fund. And, it could be more, it could be less, depending on the year.
What are the normal expenditures out of that fund? What's it used for?
It's a fund that receives money from, litigation settlement, and that's typically used for prevention and the like.
So the Attorney General we might have a suit and money would go into that from a suit that the state of Vermont wins?
That's correct.
Just so people understand.
And if you look back at the balances over the years, it was, I don't know, 400,000, 500. And then there was a year, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years ago, when it shot up to $16 million, $17 million, which reflected settlements that came in. So it varies. And sorry.
No, I'm just, in a prior session, not the recent one, but I had the Attorney General's budget area and was trying to call some things back in the brain as to this. I think currently typically budget about $2 million.
That's right.
Coming to the general fund as a typical year. Not there is a typical year, but
Of late, that money, that has gone up.
Yeah.
We typically will dial up the Attorney General at the beginning of the budgeting season and say, what do you think? And he or she will say, and typically $2 million. And they've generally hit that and they've generally exceeded.
But on the other side, last year we had a outgoing with the EV5 settlement. I don't know what that 16 million or something. And does that come out of this fund?
No.
I think we made a general fund transfer, but we still owe some of that, right?
Yes. I mean, that was actually a specific, the Attorney General was more up to speed on that than I, but yes, that was I think an $8 million additional general fund transfer.
Right, but we still owe more.
I think we had 2 of them we had to do.
There may be a second payment depending on what settlement is made with various of the so-called shareholders of EB5.
Okay.
And on that, what we actually did was pay out of the state's self-insurance liability fund, which is used for settling claims made against the state. But then we needed to make a general fund transfer back into that fund to make that fund whole. And a very good reason for that is that that's an internal service fund. So we assess it across all statewide units, and that includes, it draws down federal funds, it's indirect. So if we're settling a liability, you can't use federal funds at all for settling claims. So we had to ensure that there was that clear general fund, covering of that liability expense. The other thing I'd note on tobacco funds, it has some variability. There's some surprises when all of a sudden we've got a lot more money than we expected. And then the legislature, maybe mid-session, will find a way to deploy those funds. And there's some variability related to, even though there's not any ongoing litigation, there are cases from years ago that have been hung up in courts, with big tobacco and whatever. So something from years ago will all of a sudden reach a resolution, and then it flows, to all the participants in the litigation, including Vermont. So there's a little bit of a yo-yo that happens there. Was that all you were covering?
I was going to hand back to you for the section 70.
Okay, so section 73, which begins on the bottom of page 54, is amending statute 32 VSA 308C, which pertains to general fund and transportation fund balance reserves. And what this proposed language is doing in the first subsection is it's basically ensuring that if in the event of an emergency, the General Assembly will have access to reserve funds to deploy for emergency purposes, even if no funds were added to the balance reserve in the prior fiscal year. So the balance reserve in the general fund is the reserve that's also referred to as the rainy day reserve. And this subsection B1, as it has been written, has allowed the General Assembly to unreserve and appropriate up to 50% of the amount added in the prior fiscal year, and that was the limit. However, for many, in most recent fiscal years, there have been no amounts added to the balance reserve because the legislature has actually not withstood the 308C language that would have the surplus at the end of the year flow to the balance reserve, and instead has dedicated it for other purposes, as the administration is also proposing to do in this current Budget Adjustment Act. What that means, though, is if you end up having an emergency and you want to draw on the balance reserve, if you didn't put anything into it, you're not able to draw up to 50% of the prior year's contribution. So what's being proposed here is, instead of making the formula based on drawing on 50% of the amount added in the prior fiscal year, it's changing that to 5% of whatever the reserve balance is. And for point of reference, right now, it's a $98 million balance in the general fund balance reserve. So this would allow, with this amendment, it would allow the General Assembly to unreserve up to almost $5 million in the event of an emergency during the session for appropriation. That's what sub B1 is doing, is changing that formula. Any questions on sub B1?
If I may, why limit it to that? Is there a concern that people will diminish the fund too much? It's putting a governing factor on it. What if your emergency is 10 million or 12 million?
Well, the legislature could enact
You can do it.
whatever it wanted to do. Not terribly scientific, but I think it comes up, that results in an amount that's somewhat similar to historical, transfers into the balance fund of around $10 million. Or, apparently there's intent in existing statute to fence it to 50% of prior year, for whatever reason that predates me. So this is not dramatically changing the magnitude of the fence, but making sure there's a mechanism to access funds in any year and not have your hands tied.
Because if we're not contributing, then you can't, 50% of zero is still zero. But here it's 5% of the total, and there's always going to be something in it.
Can you give a quick example of what has been maybe added to the reserve historically? Or is it just kind of varied year to year, I suspect?
Well, years and years ago, well, I should say when at the beginning of the administration, it was about $30 million in the balance reserve. And that has moved up. It's just under $100 million currently. But the contributions are typically pretty lumpy. You know, it's not a steady amount, but it's just under $100 million now. And it's capped at 5%, to like the stabilization reserve. It can't go higher than 5% of the previous year's appropriation. So, you know, its total size could grow to probably now about $110 million.
The caseload reserve is about a similar size,
A little bit smaller.
90 some
but yeah,
odd million.
that's right.
Does that have similar parameters around it?
In terms of percentage of amount to take,
It could be removed.
that,
I'm not.
I don't want to answer that with certainty, but I think the answer is no.
Okay. I just want to, and I have no intent. I'm just trying to see what flexibility we have. Thank you.
And we have other reserves too, and maybe that's another conversation.
Well, the stabilization reserve is the main reserve.
Right.
And then there's the 2753 reserve, which is for the 27th pay period and the 53rd week Medicaid, which come up sporadically and
We just had one. Yeah.
just had,
And now we're paying, it's like every 7 years for some and 13, or I don't know, I can't remember what it is, but we put money in for it every year because we don't want to get hit with a huge bill.
Yeah.
Rep. Stevens?
Explain for me, if you will, the provisos in here that says, so the General Assembly will have access to 5% to make emergency appropriations, but the board's prohibited from providing an agency or department an amount exceeding the original appropriation. Can you explain that scenario to me? Because I'm envisioning the transportation situation where the AOT needs to fix a road from a flood or, whatever, there's a substantial need. But this is saying that we can give them money, but it can't exceed the original appropriation.
So
The total that we give them can't say if we gave them $100, we can't, and they needed 15 to fix the road, we can't give them a total of 115.
So I hadn't yet spoken to subsection B3, which I'll do now, Representative Stevens.
Great, thanks.
So subsection B1 referred to the General Assembly and the action it can take while in session. Subsection B3 is something completely new. The emergency board has never had this ability to draw on the balance reserve to access funds in the event of an emergency and need for expenditures while the legislature is not in session. So this is proposing something new. This is saying, okay, what if we have an emergency that occurs when the legislature is not in session? Can we provide some vehicle for the emergency board to access that same amount of up to 5% of the balance reserve? However, it becomes a lot more complicated when you read the statutory abilities and framework governing the emergency board. The emergency board does not have the ability to create new appropriations. It can only make transfers between appropriations, and it can authorize those activities in the event of an emergency, but only the legislature has the ability to have a new appropriation spring into existence. And that's really the reason for this somewhat complex, and it was hard to get my head around the language also. What this is saying is that, okay, since the E-Board can't create a new appropriation, and if we don't have, and what the emergency board has done in the past, for instance, last summer, I think it was draw from existing appropriations that had unused balances and can move those. But I guess what this is all about is if we don't happen to be sitting on big appropriations that the E-Board can just transfer, is there some other way that they can draw on the reserve without creating a new appropriation, which they don't appear to have the ability to do based on statute. So what this is saying is that in a real world hypothetical example, let's say DPS Emergency Management has a $1 million general fund appropriation. And let's say there's an emergency and they spend out of their existing appropriation that they already have for the fiscal year that they were already granted by the legislature in the big bill. Out of that million, they spend $200,000 on this. They deploy it for these particular activities that are over and above what, would have been included in their budget. The emergency board has the ability then, without creating a new appropriation, to draw on this reserve and using the accounting principle is more of expense reimbursement, but would basically offset, on the ledger, those expenses out of this amount. But what this is saying, and the reason it has that limit, is you can never exceed the amount that was originally appropriated by the legislature, because that's the limit, right? Otherwise, you would need to create a new appropriation to give them more than that, to have more reimbursement than that. It's a little tricky in terms of the accounting, but the intent is, okay, if people, just as we talked about earlier, with the FEMA denial reserve, if places are, reacting because they have to and spending out of their existing budgets, is there a way that we can make them whole? And this is proposing to give the e-board that ability to draw on the balance reserve up to 5% for that purpose.
Okay.
But because of the idiosyncratic aspects of the e-board powers, without drastically changing the powers of the e-board, there's kind of a limit based on whatever departments are already appropriated. That's sort of the limit that they can spend that can then be reimbursed.
I'm going to have to let that yeast rise for quite a while.
We may need to hear this more than once, but this is brand new language.
It is.
And it's as a result of the flooding the last 2 years, of other issues. What prompted this language to be put in here this time?
Well, we had to think about, in these past 2 summers, we had 2 times where, we're convening the e-board anyway for the, for the revenue forecast in July. And it's a couple weeks after a disaster, and we're looking at what can the e-board do? And what can we do? Where can we draw on funds? We've been fortunate to have things like large appropriations funded by surplus general fund that are just sitting around that haven't been deployed, so they could be drawn on for emergency purposes, but that may not always be the case.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And actually to Rev. Stevens' point about, what if it's a lot more than that? And if there was a massive emergency that was on, the governor can call a special session.
that's right.
Come back
And that's
kind of the very last fallback to an emergency.
And just, when I was listening, I know this probably isn't right, but my mindset went to the municipalities who had to spend down their cash reserves after the flooding this year. More than one of my constituent towns, had to borrow money, right, in order to pay future payroll because they spent their cash on excavation and their own repairs. And so I get that concept of where the budget ends, but this is a completely different way of, departments aren't municipalities.
That's right.
And so you're not charging those departments interest or, whatever it has to be in order to make that work. Sorry.
There's some parallels there.
Some parallels, but not in the
They don't have the
rectification
same
of.
backstop.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're moving on to section 74. So I would put this section in the category of responding to inflationary forces within the economy over the years. There's the Secretary of Administration, the Commissioner of Finance and Management. We don't have a lot of independent authority. I mean, what we do as a result of legislative action and the like. But there are certain things that we do at closeout when we're closing the books that can be somewhat independent. The first is to allow, there's an allowance in statute for moving money within an agency from one department or one agency appropriation to another. And that is allowed for amounts up to $50,000. So if you picture, say, at closeout towards the end of the year, there may be one department that's running kind of tight, another department within, say, the agency of administration that's got extra. You can move small amounts of money up to $50,000 between. And that is done not infrequently. You know, we do that. Physically, the process is they submit to us a request. We review it. I review it and sign it. And ultimately, it's the Secretary of Administration signs off on it and the money moves within that agency or department. Keep in mind, we can't move money, say, from the agency of administration to the Department of Public Safety or any other. So it's kind of intra-agency. That amount is $50,000. It hasn't changed actually, I think in the explanation you have the years, since May 1999. So we're just putting an inflationary indicator to it and saying, you know, I guess in 1999, it went from 25,000 to 50,000, or saying 50,000. So that's the first thing. You know, we would ask you to think about keeping some real amount consistent. Secondarily, I mentioned, you know, half tongue in cheek to you before.
10 cents, yeah.
So also at closeout, I have the ability to sweep into the general fund amounts less than $100. So instead of coming to you and saying we have, you know, I don't know, $97.10 left over in this appropriation, we're reverting it. I can simply just sweep it into the general fund. The same thing is achieved. We just don't inform you of it. So we're saying there too, I think it was 2004 when the last time that was bumped up. So we're saying, you know, inflation in that time, this would be about $200. So for your consideration.
There actually is, back on the
Right.
reversions list, there is one for $126.
Right.
That's for $5.10.
Right, so this would propose to make that disappear from a future bill.
So the $5.10 one should have gone too.
Yeah.
You missed that.
I mean,
This one,
we don't catch every one of them, but we typically do. So anyway, this would give me awesome authority. And as long as I'm not sweeping it into my own bank account, you guys should be okay. So anyway, that is the import of section 74. You know, the next three sections are essentially bringing statute along, and that would be section 75, 76, and 77 is kind of bringing statute along to the new practice. I think, was it last year that we started transferring money to debt service fund and then paying debt service, or was it the year before?
It's last
I
year.
think it was last year.
During budget adjustment.
Right. So back in the day, we would appropriate money to an appropriation to a fund essentially. And then from that, we would pay our debt service. Now, what we do is and you'll see this in the D100 in one section, transfer general fund into a debt service fund. And then from that debt service fund, we pay our debt service. So instead of being a direct appropriation, it's a transfer.
It is.
Well, there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that's generally accepted accounting principles for government operations. Most states do that. The other reason is that we reserve against prior year's appropriations. So if we're essentially appropriating and then transferring and then paying debt service, we thought it's easier just to do a direct transfer. So, but really it's generally, that's what states do. It's generally accepted accounting principles that we're adhering to.
The
It's
effect
not,
it has is that because it's not an appropriation, it doesn't count as part of the money that would go to increase our reserves.
that's right.
So that is something that we want to keep an eye on, because over time, that's money that's not going into the reserves. And if it's 3 million a year, pretty soon it's a lot of money. And as long as we feel that our reserves are kept at the level that they should be kept, then this is okay. But this was a big change, and we had a lot of conversation last year about this, because it saves money on one end, but it affects our reserves on the other side. And we want to be sure our reserves are healthy as well.
Understood. Again, I would remind you, this is, again, not something we invented. This is what most states do.
Yes.
So anyway, this brings statute along to that practice. In addition, you will recall there is one appropriation in B1000 that is 600, I think it's $675,000 that comes from, that's a proposal or recommendation from the treasurer's office, where the treasurer tells us what he thinks debt issuance costs for the following year will be, or for the fiscal year will be. And that amount is then used to pay for debt issuance costs, which could be, marketing, it could be brokerage fees, could be any number of things. Years and years ago, that was actually paid by essentially taking a small amount out of what each department that accessed these borrowed funds used. So if whatever the Agency of Natural Resources was part of the debt issuance, they were going to use $2 million to build a new maintenance shed at a state park. They, instead of getting $2 million, they get $1,990,000, and some amount of money would be taken for the cost of issuing that. That's a little clunky administratively. So there again, what many states have done, and what we now do is we just appropriate money to the B1000 and we use that too. So this you'll see that is section 77. So again, sections 75, 76, and 77 are just kind of bringing statute up to what our current practice is.
Set on that, Adam.
I am all set up.
Okay, I'll speak to section 78 at the top of page 58. And section 78 is amending what we typically refer to as cash fund statute 32 VSA 1001. And what's happening here, this is really a technical change to the statute to try to create parity between the review and reallocation process for capital cash fund appropriations and bonded dollar appropriations in the capital bill. And it appears that was the intent behind the language in the statute that's being struck, which reads, any entity authorized to make expenditures from the capital infrastructure subaccount shall have not more than 2 years from the legislative session in which the act authorizing the expenditure was enacted to encumber the funds. And any remaining unencumbered funds shall remain part of the fund account. And so if you look up the proposed change is to just strike that language and say the spending authority authorized in the capital infrastructure subaccount shall be subject to the provisions of 32 VSA 701A, which, if you don't recall the text of that statute off the top of your head, I brought along a copy. And so this is the statute that pertains to the capital construction bill. So all the rules that go along with the capital bill. It's got 701A has a sub C that reads as follows. The spending authority authorized by a capital construction act shall carry forward until expended unless otherwise provided. And then it provides otherwise in sub 1, all unexpended funds remaining for projects authorized by capital construction acts enacted in a legislative session that was 2 or more years prior to the current legislative session shall be reported to the General Assembly and may be reallocated in future capital construction acts. It also adds in sub 2, notwithstanding sub 1 of this subsection, any amounts appropriated in a previous capital construction act that are unexpended for at least 5 years shall be reallocated to future capital construction acts. And then it also provides in sub D, on or before November 15th of each year, Commissioner of Finance and Management, provides a report on all the capital appropriations enacted in a legislative session that was 2 or more years prior, to show the current fund balances and let everybody know what they have to work with. So this 2-year sort of language in the cash fund statute sort of approximates that that structure that pertains to capital appropriations, but it doesn't align exactly. And there are some unintended consequences and unclarity. It's not clear the date cash fund appropriations would be reallocated exactly. Is that's based on session adjournment date versus date of the authorizing bill passage? It could have an unintended consequence like prematurely halting a project. And so it's really just saying, okay, you wanted this to work like the capital ones. Let's just refer to that statute and say it works like that. And it'll also add that 5-year reallocation as well as the 2-year report and potential reallocation. So really a technical, I think technical cleanup is how I would describe that. Any questions before moving off section 78? Okay, so I'm going to move next to section 80. And this is
Pause for just a second.
Sure.
The traumatic brain, section 79 is again eliminating a program. This is what we talked about before. It's eliminating a balance.
That's right. I didn't mention that because we have a special fund. That's a traumatic brain injury fund that hasn't been used for.
So that's similar to what we did in section.
That's similar to the workforce education training. Both of those, that balance and the WET fund, workforce education training fund, were transferred to the general fund.
Okay, thank you.
And it's projected to be about $1,500 at the end of this fiscal year. Its own, that will vary depending on compounding interest. And in fact, in the D100 section, the way we wrote it was whatever the balance is remaining at the end of the fiscal year will transfer. But the scale is only about $1,500 on that one. So on section 80 is essentially boilerplate annual language that provides the Secretary of Administration the authority to approve the carry forward of existing spending authority into the next fiscal year within the executive branch appropriations for this various list of funds. And the only reason I'm drawing your attention to this is that we're adding a fund to this list that we expect probably should have been added a couple of years ago when the Technology Modernization Special Fund was established. And so we're making that change now and adding that to the list of funds that should carry forward at the end of the year. And so I guess as an example, for instance, I can refer back to the discussion we had on the ERP appropriation that was made in 2023 for $11.8 million. And so none of that has actually been spent yet. But because there was no carry forward of the original appropriation, there's been sort of a bizarre situation where at the end of the fiscal year, the balance remaining in that appropriation, the spending authority just vanishes. It turns into a pumpkin rather than carry forward. And perhaps more than any other type of fund appropriation, the Technology Modernization Fund appropriations are very much multi-year, they're the least likely to get spent in a single fiscal year, I guess I would put it that way. So we've had to do some gymnastics in order to restore the spending authority so that the project can still be, there can still be work on the project after the end of the fiscal year that would involve using what's called excess receipts authority, which is something, I would probably need about a half an hour to give a real good primer on the excess receipts statute and how that works. But the way it really was, originally intended, I think, to work is if you've got something like a stream of funds from a federal grant, and if all of a sudden more comes in than you were expecting, well, we can authorize an increase in spending authority as long as it's for the same purpose as, what the original grant and spending authority was for. Or another example is if fee revenue came in higher than it was originally projected, and we only set our spending authority to here, but we realized more revenue because parks had a record year. And we've also got other cost pressures, but it's in line with the original appropriation. We can give that spending authority. I don't think it was conceived to replace $11.8 million into an appropriation that just expired because it wasn't in the list of carry forward funds. So it's a rather broad interpretation, I feel like, of the carry forward authority statute, but we've been forced to use it. But there's not actually any new anticipated receipts of revenue into the fund. The revenue is the same that was always in the fund, but the spending authority disappeared. So this is really a technical correction to say, okay, for this fund, like the other ones named here, that spending authority can carry forward. So if there are any questions on section 80. Okay, that just leaves effective dates.
I have a question.
Good question.
Just very quick back on 79 on the cash fund, and where I wrote down there, I just want to make sure I tell somebody else this with the bond. Essentially, what we're trying to do is mirror the bonded dollar process.
Yes,
The cash fund process.
exactly. Yep.
Madam Chair, before we go, I did want to mention, lest you think I purposely skipped, section 71. I neglected to review, I would call that perhaps a Freudian slip, since it deals with the marking of underground utilities. And that was language that was inserted in the adjustment request of the Public Service Department. They would be very happy to come in and speak to you. They believe that legislation that passed last year unintentionally excluded utilities and treated excavators. They want to correct that. And it's for the marking of underground objects, presumably in advance of construction projects. There's a certain time frame in which utilities and excavators have to respond. This is extending that time frame by 24 hours. And I think there was an unintentional.
No, it was a
It was
mistake.
just a mistake.
You're familiar with the dig safe process?
Yeah.
Staff to interact. I believe what it does is that essentially it gives a longer amount of time for the utility to mark. And it should have changed the time to start the excavation to mirror that. But I think it creates a situation where you could actually start excavating before they even got there to mark, which is probably not what was intended, right? So.
So I did not mean to skip over that, but anyway, Public Service Department would be very happy to come in.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in. We have to leave. These guys need a break. I don't know if it's a question you want to ask quickly right now, Rep. Giacomoni?
I think it's a quick
Okay.
answer. Section 54, page 40 gives the, I think the vendor general authority to convert 8 limited service positions to exempts. I was just curious, why exempts and not classified?
They're attorneys, typically attorneys are exempt.
One of them's an attorney, one's an assistant secretary, one's an IT worker. They didn't seem like that, but just because he could set the wage, maybe have more flexibility.
I don't know. That'd be a good question to ask him.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, and that would be Trevor's portfolio, yes?
I don't know the answer.
Oh, yeah, so he can, he'll be asking that question too. Thank you both very much. We'll be having you back for various things, I know, but we appreciate getting this overview. committee will take a break as soon as I stop talking. And
Just a 10-minute break.
I think it's 15, I think it takes at least 2:15.
Oh,
Thank you.
Yeah, so, but before,
Up to you.
yeah, that's what the agenda is. We're meeting at 9:30 tomorrow. I'll have Aaron send out the email to you, everybody's portfolio, so everybody knows what they
Makes
have.
more sense now.
I'm happy to talk to you as we're going through here. I was thinking, oh, I hope that this person knows that that's going to be in their portfolio. And Lynn, I just need to give you yours before I head out of here. So